Good morning, everyone. My name is Olga Jonas. I work for the World Bank. I'm the coordinator of Avian and Human Influenza Program at the bank, and it's my real pleasure to be here today, especially in this session, which is going to look at the identifying of needs and assessing capabilities in developing countries based on country profiles. And I hope in the discussion we'll get to what we may mean by country profiles and how the assessment of the capabilities and of the needs may happen in different circumstances. We have one speaker today, so there will be a lot of time for comments and for questions afterwards, and I know that the presentation is very thought-provoking, so I hope we won't run into coffee time. I would like to introduce, it's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. John Boslego. He leads the Vaccine Development Global Program at PATH. This program seeks to identify and facilitate development of safe, effective, and affordable vaccines in developing countries. John's career spans 30 years of service in the U.S. government and in private industry. He has worked for nearly 2 decades in vaccine research, and he brings extensive experience in vaccine development. So with that introduction, may I ask John to please go ahead?
Well, thank you, Olga, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to be here and to communicate our work that's happening at PATH. Our mission is to improve the health of people around the world. We're a non-profit organization, and it really has 3 pillars. We work by advancing technologies, by strengthening healthcare systems, and by encouraging healthy behaviors. And my work is primarily related to the advancing technologies piece because we work primarily on developing vaccines. PATH has a large presence. We have about 1,000 employees. We're headquartered in Seattle, but we have extensive organizations and offices around the world, particularly in Asia and Africa. Although PATH has been around for many years, 33 actually, about in the last decade or so, about half of our work has really been focusing now on vaccines. And that spans the range of activities relating to increasing the availability of available vaccines, increasing the uptake, the rapid uptake of newly licensed vaccines, developing technologies to support vaccines, and then working with partners to develop and produce new vaccines. So why are we doing this? Well, some of the disease targets I'll mention in a few minutes. So some of these vaccine targets, disease targets do not have vaccines available to them. And in other cases, the vaccines that are available are really not affordable. And how do we do this? We identify candidates and partners. These partners could be academia, large pharmaceutical companies, small biotechs, non-governmental organizations, and we basically do partnerships with them. Our key contributions are financial resources. We also bring technical expertise, and we bring a whole bevy of different partnerships that could help to produce these development projects. These are difficult and expensive and very time-consuming efforts, so it's not a given that you could make a vaccine against a disease. And the goal is to accelerate the development of new life-saving vaccines against selected disease targets. So currently at PATH, we have activities across 7 disease targets, which include pneumococcal disease, rotavirus, enterotoxigenic E. coli, Shigella, influenza, which is the topic, obviously, of this conference, malaria, and meningococcal disease. Our most advanced program, actually, is the meningococcal disease program, and that This is really directed towards the Group A meningococcal disease problem in sub-Saharan Africa. And that program is about 9 years old. It's a collaboration with SII in India. And the vaccine progress actually is such that the phase 3 studies are done. The dossier has been put together. It's been submitted to the government of India. It'll go into the WHO for pre-qualification, and we really expect this to be licensed and available, licensed hopefully in 2010, and available hopefully for the 2011 meningococcal disease season in Africa. You're not supposed to really read what's up here, but it is a pictorial that basically shows the breadth of what's happening on the PDP front. So the top line there represents the large pharmaceutical companies. The second line represents the PDPs. So there are a large number now of PDPs that are working with large pharmaceutical companies. The third line in the red represents smaller pharmaceutical companies, and the bottom line represents biotechs and some industry. Some academia. In total, then, there's roughly 90 biological products in development through PDPs. It's a very large portfolio. There are 77 academic partners and a large number of biotechs and large pharmaceutical companies. So this is really a phenomenon that's grown tremendously in the last 10 years, driven in large part really by the contributions of the Gates Foundation. So our partners include large pharmaceutical companies, smaller biotech companies. We partner also with public health and governmental organizations, also with other NGOs, and with developing country manufacturers. These manufacturers are approached and assessed basically on their interest, their expertise, and in some cases their intellectual property. We have a number of associations obviously with the U.S. government as well, and in some cases the NIH, which has licensed some of their technology to developing world manufacturers. That certainly is the case for the meningococcal program, for the rotavirus program, and for dengue. In terms of looking at the selection of who we would potentially want to partner with, certainly if that manufacturer has a licensed vaccine for human use, that certainly is a major plus. And also if that manufacturer resides in a country that has a functional national regulatory authority, that's also a major plus. And if the manufacturer is WHO pre-qualified. We certainly strive for the level of quality, if you will, that would allow for WHO pre-qualification, because our interest is not only to allow for the licensure of products in the country of manufacture, but also to allow them to be distributed to the developing world, and that really goes through the WHO system. And in order to get purchased by UNICEF, of course, one has to have WHO pre-qualification. So the partnerships that are put together by PATH and other PDPs, we help to direct the R&D, the manufacturing and distribution. Our goals basically are to lead to availability, accessibility, and affordability of the products. So as opposed to what one might think in large pharmaceutical companies, we start very early on looking at things such as cost of goods. If our products are not going to be affordable in the populations in the countries that we're aiming them for, then it really isn't something that we want to really start off on. So very early on, its affordability is a very important feature, but added to that, of course, are the safety and efficacy as well. And we negotiate with organizations very early on, again, to ensure what we call the global access. And that basically means that the programs that we work on, the products that we work on, are going to be available to the populations that are in need. So the key components of this global access program basically are affordability and pricing, capacity. It's not enough basically just to produce a quantity of vaccine that's available just for the country of origin. We're looking for larger quantities. Obviously, the populations that we're interested in are quite large. The birth cohort, for example, of the Gavi-eligible countries is about 78 million children per year. So that's really a large population of the infants. And if you look at the population the total population of Gavi-eligible countries, it's about 2.8 billion people. So it's a large population. So in terms of influenza, we know that between 250,000 and 500,000 people die every year from seasonal influenza, and the most severe pandemic can cause up to 50 million deaths. There certainly is a large gap between what can be produced currently compared to what the needs would be. And the current influenza vaccines are difficult to produce in large quantities. I'm not really a fan either of the inactivated flu-based vaccines, certainly not for solving the pandemic problem in the developing world. But I actually think that the program, I'm a big fan of the WHO program. I think that it starts off by, even though we're dealing with ancient technology, it really gets manufacturers into the ballgame. It allows for the production of a small amount of vaccine, but this vaccine certainly would be available to help with immunization of, say, healthcare workers and first responders. That would be very, very helpful. It also helps these manufacturers to work with the influenza strains every year. That's not a trivial deal. And so working on each year with the influenza strains is very, very helpful. Getting reagents, developing potency assays is also helpful. And then, of course, doing clinical trials and getting the serology assay set up. I think all these things are really helpful for what we consider to be better technologies coming down the pike, but won't be available certainly for the next 5 to 10 years. So our goal in the influenza vaccine program at PATH is the development of promising new vaccine technologies focusing on novel technologies, and we've actually selected 2 that we think are the most propitious as far as helping to solve this particular problem. And they are the recombinant and the live attenuated. These technologies, we believe, are inexpensive. They can be ramped up very quickly, and they can deal with a pandemic in real time. Of course, they have not proven yet, at least in terms of the recombinant technology, so there's a lot of development work that has to be done, but we think they have sufficient promise, and that certainly is where we are spending our time and effort. I think the other thing I would say from the PDP point of view is that the influenza field is really has so much money associated with it from governments and in other organizations that we're not a very big player. But nonetheless, we are forward-looking. We're looking at technologies that we think will be very, very helpful in 5 to 10 years, and we're not going to really participate in this particular epidemic or pandemic this time. So I talked about the recombinant technologies. They don't rely upon eggs. They're rapid. They could provide a very quick response in a pandemic. We're working with a company called Lentigen. It's producing a low-cost recombinant vaccine, viral-like particle, that we hope would be very immunogenic. Most of our programs early on, at least, are still preclinical. And we have 2 vaccine development programs. One is with Lentigen, and the second is with the Institute of Experimental Medicine in Russia. That's the live attenuated technology. I mentioned that as being our second favored, if you will, technology. And then we have a variety of different associations with groups that are helping us to do this. We really hope that in the next year or so we'll be able to sign a number of additional agreements that will focus either on live attenuated or different recombinant technologies. Just wanted to mention, Kathy Newsel is here, but I wanted to mention that the The other activities on our influenza front involve doing a clinical trial. This is supported actually by the U.S. CDC in Senegal. It's a large clinical trial. It's with approved, licensed Sanofi trivalent seasonal influenza vaccine. And this trial is in children. It's really the first major trial in the tropical areas, and it's used as both a probe to look at the disease burden of influenza in tropical regions, as well as to define the efficacy of the standard vaccines against disease in the tropical regions. So that study is ongoing. And the data certainly will be very, very helpful to the field overall, particularly as we look at influenza disease in tropical regions. It's Africa's actually largest influenza trial. The other activity was mentioned yesterday by Rick Bright. We have an activity in Vietnam. This is closely associated with the WHO activity as well in terms of building regional capacity, and we're looking at working with several of the manufacturing organizations of Vietnam to kickstart, if you will, their manufacturing and development of inactivated, primarily vaccines in Vietnam. So in conclusion, vaccines we feel are a major public health tool. We're working across a variety of fields at PATH, but specifically in my area, we're working to develop new vaccines that hopefully can be made available to the populations around the world, but particularly in developing world populations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, John. Maybe to start off, if I could ask you to elaborate on one point that you have. You have the 7 different vaccine programs that PATH is active in. And you are also active in, I think, 70 countries, developing countries. So you have a pretty broad view of the importance of these vaccine programs in different countries. What do you see the relative sort of priority of influenza among these 7 programs in different kind of countries? Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, where does influenza vaccine fall when you are discussing with ministries of health in different countries about their vaccination priorities?
Yeah, I would say that 5 years ago, it wasn't on the agenda at all. There wasn't really any interest in influenza in the developing world. Not because I don't think people didn't believe it was a problem. It was just one of the much lower priorities for health in the developing countries. I think that the H5N1, particularly in Asia, and then the H1 has really spurred a lot of additional interest in this particular problem, and I think it's tragic that there's a pandemic, obviously, but it does have some positive spin-offs in that there has been a lot of interest generated by this, and I think that a lot of these activities that you see that started even before the H1N1 really have gained a lot of momentum because of this pandemic, and the realization that these countries in the populations are not going to basically realize much benefit from the standard manufacturing practices, and they really have to be able to develop products that they can distribute internally.
Mm-hmm. And can you point to specific countries, like is it more in Asia that the importance has been realized?
Yeah, I think it's around the world.
Africa?
No, I think it's around the world. I think that certainly Asia has a burgeoning manufacturing capacity, India, China, and others. I think that Africa certainly suffers from not having many developing manufacturing organizations, but certainly there are facilities in South Africa, in Egypt, in Senegal, and hopefully those will be increased in terms of their capacity as well. There certainly are manufacturing capacities in South America, Brazil, in particular, Mexico, that also have benefited, from not only the interest but also the financial support of some of the organizations.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe can we open it up to comments and questions on the presentation or on the broader topic of the session? Yes?
I think so. Thanks, John. Congratulations to Path. By the way, for those of you who don't know, Path is the most recent recipient of the Conrad Hilton Humanitarian Prize. It's quite a prestigious prize.
Thank you. Yeah. I usually try to point that out. I forgot.
My question is, we look at, you put up the 6 billion people courses that we need to have, which is, what WHO and other folks have sort of set a goal, which is really, in where we are now, not a realistic goal, as everyone knows. So I'm wondering if there are differences in countries that you could depend on to, rather than go for the population vaccination, you go for the target groups. I mean, as we did this time, the high-risk groups were identified fairly early on by both WHO and other national authorities. And I just wonder if there's any parsing of the countries where you could depend upon the governments to, at least maybe not target the whole population, but at least have an influence on the most rapid delivery of some vaccine.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Before this particular pandemic, we actually, in terms of trying to prepare for one, we did talk to a variety of ministries of health and other organizations in countries trying to look at their pandemic preparedness plans, and these plans were all over the board. I mean, there were some that were really quite well developed, but the vast majority were in their infancy. And so trying to get a handle on how a country would deal with the pandemic in terms of who they would target first was only happening in a very, very small number. And so we certainly don't, we don't believe that we're the people to decide that. Obviously, it's the country. But we're trying to spur the development of those plans without a lot of success. But I think that the pandemic, again, has helped to catalyze that decision-making process, and obviously the availability of some vaccine through the WHO in terms of donations and others has even helped even more, because they know they don't have enough for the entire population, so they have to decide who they're going to get it, and it forces the governments basically to make those decisions, which I think is a very good thing.
Okay.
David Wood from WHO. Just to supplement on that, as part of the pandemic response and preparedness, to receive the donations that are coming to countries, there have been a series of workshops that have been run by WHO with the countries who are going to be receiving those vaccines to do exactly what you've just been describing, to make sure that they have plans in place as to how they're going to, who they're going to immunise, how they're going to reach those target groups, and to talk through and work through with them the logistics of actually doing that. So, as you say, the pandemic has forced a lot of this thinking and is actually making, I think, considerable progress in this way, and countries are having to prepare for the reality of having vaccine in place, and so that is happening.
Yep. On a related point, we didn't bring this up yesterday in terms of planning. It's not part of this workshop, but, it's not obviously just enough to manufacture vaccine. I mean, you have to have needles and syringes, and, there's issues related to the supply of those particular products, and you certainly have to have a distribution system. That distribution system for EPI, is out there. It's really designed for infants and children, and it's got a lot of issues associated with it in terms of cold chain and so forth and so on. So there's a lot more to be done other than just manufacturing vaccine. It's a huge problem.
Could you talk a little bit, I have actually two questions. One is, could you talk a little bit about how PATH goes about assessing capacity in order to develop a work plan in a particular country to provide capacity building, how you go about the assessment of where they are, what they need, what are the priority interventions, what do you do first, what do you do next. And my second question that's related to that is, are there any consistent metrics internationally of how to approach assessing capacity? And if not, should there be?
Well, it's a complex question. I guess I would start off by saying that on the vaccine development arena, we're limited by the funding that we have from donor organizations, and we're primarily funded by the Gates Foundation. I mean, we do have additional funding. We have funding from DFID. We also have funding from the Research Council of Norway, but we are targeted really on the disease targets that I mentioned, and we don't have the ability to basically go out and start working on new vaccines. We have to rely upon what the donors are willing to support. So those 7 disease targets are basically what we're working on currently. We hope that can be expanded, obviously, as time goes on. But given those disease targets, then, we search for organizations that have an interest in those, in this case, vaccines. And so we will put out requests for proposals. We do an extensive amount of attendance at meetings and discussions, and we'll try to identify organizations that have an interest in those disease targets, and it's not very hard because they're important disease targets. And a lot of them actually are what we call dual use. So these disease targets like pneumococcal disease and rotavirus and influenza really have an interest not only in developing world but also developed world. So there's an opportunity there for organizations such as large pharmaceutical companies and others that can really do this on a commercial end. But we try to carve out a piece of that development that will actually result in product availability and affordability for resource-poor organizations as well. So our main purpose, obviously, is not capacity building. Our main purpose is developing a product that will be helpful to the health of these populations, but obviously we recognize that part of that is capacity building, and we certainly throw all of the resources that we have in that as well, because we believe that as time goes on in the next decade or two, that capacity building will help those organizations in the developing world to actually be more sustainable.
Are there international metrics? I mean, if I were walking into a country for the first time, what's my checklist in terms of where they are and where they need to be?
I think I'd refer back to the slide that I talked about in terms of, the first question that we ask, and I'll talk about the companies rather than the countries. We look to work with companies that have experience in development or even manufacture of human vaccines. So it's not that we won't talk to anybody that doesn't have that, but certainly that's the top priority. If you're manufacturing a human vaccine, that's really a major step forward. And then if you also have an interest in the programs that we're interested in, but also have R&D capabilities, and then also have a functional regulatory authority. Those are very important metrics, because it's not good enough just to develop a product. It's got to be safe and effective, and so we actually demand of the organizations that we work with that they develop a program and a development program that's going to acquire the necessary information that will show these products are safe and effective. And we're using the WHO pre-qualification standard as something that we will require.
Okay.
My name is Mohammed Rabia. I'm representing the Egyptian company which is called Vaxera. The only company works in this field in Egypt. Actually, my question to you, Dr. Boslego, concerning the terms that you have just mentioned now in your presentation concerning the partnership with the manufacturing companies working in a developing country, like in our case. You mentioned that you have to select, your selection is based on the functioning of the NRA, and also the pre-qualification is a plus. So let me tell you that the recognition or the functioning of the NRA, something which takes a lot of years and a lot of financial resources, because in our country we went through this experience since January 2006, and up till now we didn't get this recognition or this functioning, but we're expecting, with the support of the WHO, and Dr. David Wood is just sitting in front of me now, that by March, let's hope by March, we will get this recognition now. So in this case now we are going to go into the journey of the pre-qualification, and also again you know that the pre-qualification will not take for each product at least 2 to 3 years. So why PAS is not supporting these activities? I mean the recognition of the NRA and the pre-qualification of the products before we talk about the partnership as a final step. I mean, because these are the basics that you are building your partnership. So why don't you go into this basis and help the companies to get up, you got my points.
Yes. Well, first of all, I would hope that the pre-qualification process doesn't take 2 to 3 years. I mean, I know it can, but there's a lot of activities associated with making that process a little bit more streamlined than that. But yes, we actually do. We work with a number of different organizations that reside in countries that do not have functional regulatory authorities and do not have pre-qualified products. But we bring in our own consultants that basically know what those requirements would be. And so we're not working at the NRA level, but we're working at the company level to develop the quality and manufacturing practices that when these countries or companies are basically going to submit their programs, that we believe that the work will result in a pre-qualified product. So we wish we could solve all the problems, but we're focusing mainly on the companies rather than the NRAs.
Okay, so in our case, if you don't mind, let's hope that by March we will get this recognition now. So in our case, as a Vaxera now, you mentioned that the pre-qualification is a plus, so it's not necessary. I mean, in this case,
we're working with actually a number of different companies that do not have a pre-qualified product.
Yes.
And their NRAs are not pre-qualified. I mean, an excellent example is China. So China does not have a pre-qualified, a functional NRA. But we're working there with the assumption that they're going to pursue that, and they'll be successful over the course of the next, hopefully the next couple of years.
So can you elaborate more, please, about how to get in partnership with your organization? I mean, in case of Vaxera?
Sure. You can talk to that woman right there.
The beautiful woman.
Kathy Newsel, and she will help you.
Okay. Okay. To follow the procedure, I mean.
Well, we put out what we call requests for proposals. And so when we're starting a new program, we will issue these requests basically saying that in flu, for example, we've got a flu program. We're interested in companies that want to partner with us. We have an interest in, developing new technologies. And if you're interested, send us a letter and we'll talk.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's someone over there. Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Kansuke Nagaoka. I'm from Japanese Foreign Ministry. Yesterday, from different presentations, we learned that in general, among the developing countries, there are two categories. One who has a more advanced, and the other who is less advanced. I mean, the first group, say those countries like, say, Thailand or Vietnam or India, Egypt, say those who have completed, say, trial period or pilot stage, and maybe, say, going further down to the scaling up the production of influenza vaccine. And the second category is obviously those who have not yet reached that stage. And I understand that this session's topic, identifying needs and assessing capabilities of developing countries, so it must be discussed against this background. I mean, well, taking fully into account these differences among different categories of the developing countries. And I understand that the PATH has a lot of experiences in different kinds of developing countries. So could you try to give us the general assessment of, say, needs and the capabilities of the first type of countries and also the second type of countries?
I'm not sure I completely caught the question. Let me take a stab at it. I think that the first comment would be that in general, the developing country manufacturers have been extremely good in terms of large-scale production, having established processes. They've been less robust, if you will, in terms of development, R&D. That I believe is changing. It's not changing across the board, but certainly it's changing in selected organizations, again, such as SII, who are developing R&D capabilities, which I believe is obviously a very positive development, because this is going to lead, we hope, to the ability of these companies to produce vaccines, new vaccines, and not be relying totally upon the large pharmaceutical companies. There's a variety of different capabilities out there. There are groups that have been around for many, many decades that do very well just in manufacturing, but really have not gone to the R&D stage yet, and we're working with both categories, and we're trying to stimulate the R&D part, because we think that's where the major bottleneck is, if you will, and that really goes across the board, whether it be in India or China or any other country. It's something that we do as part of what we consider the capacity building end. Did I catch your question? I'm not sure I actually did.
Yes. Well, I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, because I try to know the specific differences from, say, those who have completed the pilot stage, and they are required to invest more in the scaled up production, and which does require, say, specific unique challenges compared to the second categories of countries who have not yet reached that stage. I mean, they need, say, more seed money, probably from WHO or other donors, and they need to have more time to complete the pilot stage. So that's my question. Thank you.
Just a comment, I think, on what was mentioned yesterday in terms of these WHO grants, and actually Marie-Paul can comment if I'm off on this one, but I think actually most of these, a lot of these companies that had put in for these grants were actually getting money from their internal governments prior to the announcement of these grants. And these grants, in other words, the grants didn't start the interest by the governments. The government interest came first, and then the grants really helped to kickstart the actual production. And absolutely, the vast majority of these organizations that are receiving the WHO grants are actually, the WHO money, the HHS money is really a very small part of what these governments are investing, which I think is also a very positive thing.
Okay.
Marie-Paul, is that a fair comment?
I think it depends, but at least you're right that in the sense that as we requested to have evidence of government support, the fact that these manufacturers applied also forced them to consult their government, and this in some instances was responsible for initiating an interest from these governments.
Yesterday we heard of some of the geographic gaps in Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Do you have any sense of are there candidates that are near or at the point of ability to advance farther in terms of developing products?
When you say candidates, are you talking about actual vaccine or companies?
Companies.
Well, there certainly is a large number. I think in the developing country manufacturing network, vaccine manufacturing network, there's probably 20. Suresh? No, companies. 28. There's 28 companies that are part of the developing country vaccine manufacturing network. So that network basically meets on a yearly basis. They meet to discuss common problems, advances, progress in different ways that they can coordinate their manufacturing and development. It's a very positive organization. We had a very successful meeting in Beijing just in September. But it's not a coordinated effort in terms of trying to identify countries and starting things. This is really a organization that has to rely upon companies that already exist. So I don't know of anybody that's out there actually trying to build something from the start, targeting the fact that there's not much in Africa or there's not much in Central Asia. There's no group that's out there trying to basically build that. I think that we're basically relying upon the companies that are in existence. In the vast majority of these companies in this network recognize that they have a obligation, if you will, for targeting developing world populations. And so, SII, they basically immunize the world against measles. So it's not as if they're just looking at their own country. They really do recognize the need of the entire poor populations, and they work towards it.
But I think your answer brings up a question that we've heard prior to this workshop and in many fora, in terms of if we're to develop a framework or a strategy to move forward. We hear from many developing countries that individual countries would like to have the manufacturing capacity in their country for their population. And there are limits to resources. One would not necessarily want to build 193 influenza vaccine facilities. So to generate some of the discussion here in terms of what I'm hearing is, at least for flu and for developing new products, go with companies that have a track record. And then what do we say to those who don't have a track record? And so far, at least in terms of influenza, those who have a track record, it's not anticipated that they would meet a pandemic need. So we're trying to find some balance of how we should think about planning. And we talked about regionalization, and so for purposes of not just for the speaker and for the moderator, but for people in the audience, is what is an appropriate balance? What would be the criteria to say in country X, and we don't want to be critical of certain countries or companies, but what is sort of the minimum that we need to be sure or at least could guide us towards some potential success in building capacity, because we are faced with, in some countries, starting from scratch, as we say, or building on what they already have, and that's a difficult dynamic to navigate when there are a lot of have-nots.
Yeah, I think maybe part of the answer or way to approach this is what we haven't really covered yet, is the demand for the vaccines, because for the sustainability there would need to be sort of assured financing for the production that going forward. And from what John mentioned is that 5 years ago influenza was not even on the radar screen of most countries most developing countries in the world, and that has now begun to change. But there would have to be a very careful assessment of the demand and of the capacity of the country to sustain the production capacity for the decision to go ahead. And we haven't really looked at this, but it would probably be quite difficult to find many, especially smaller countries without any existing capacities that could justify such a substantial investment, because it does cost a lot of money, and over a number of years. I mean, you have to sustain it for a long period. Mary Paul, do you want to
let me just make one comment on that as well. I think that it was mentioned yesterday about are there ways to centralize regulatory activities? A lot of these countries don't have adequate regulatory activities, and could you centralize a regulatory activity so it would help a variety of different countries? I certainly think that there's room for work on that area, but the actual the definition of a functional regulatory authority has to do with the idea that once these products are developed, in the manufacture of biologics is a very complex operation, and it goes awry constantly. And so you can't assume that once you manufacture and have your clinical studies done that that's going to be it for that product. I mean, it's got to be monitored constantly. And so that's very difficult for a WHO or a regional activity or somebody else to do that. You've got to have a regulatory authority in country that can actually monitor that. So that's part of the problem. You can't just basically put up a factory. You've got to have a large infrastructure, or otherwise you're bound to have all kinds of issues, safety issues, other issues that just are not positive at all.
We also made it a prerequisite that the manufacturers should have at least one other vaccine that would be licensed in the country for use in humans. And this was because we do not believe that a producer can be sustainable and remain there on the market only on the basis of production of influenza vaccine, even if it includes seasonal. So because you have to put in place all the QC, the QA infrastructure, the marketing in certain cases. So this is really one of the factors that would also limit the number of new production sites that would come to bear, I think.
Yeah, Kathy Newsel. I'm the director of the PATH Influenza Vaccine Project. And it's interesting, a lot of the regional capacity building and sustainability we're talking about is the short or medium-term solution. And as we brought up yesterday, really a longer-term solution, but something which should be our goal would be these newer technologies. And John mentioned several programs that are part of our influenza program, but one One is certainly the Gates-funded program, which is focused, as John pointed out, on the newer technologies, the recombinant technologies, adjuvants, technologies that could be easier to make. I just wanted to bring up to this audience another challenge in going through this program now for a year and a half that's really unanticipated, and it has to do with the business side of influenza vaccine and new technology development. And I will just mention two examples. We've talked a lot about a business model. When you look at the companies that we're working with, you'll see that there, as John mentioned, frequently early biotechnology and academic institutions. And that is because our focus is not on making a vaccine, but our focus is on developing a vaccine that's accessible and affordable to the developing world. And those are really two very different issues. So it is a requirement of our partnerships, a contractual requirement actually, that we have the global access issues that John mentioned. And that could be cost. You know, you must sell this vaccine at X price, which is written into a contract. So you can imagine if you have a later stage company who is successful and on the verge of success, and I can't name names, but this has happened to our influenza program in 2 instances in the last year, they will say, we're happy to work with you, but we will not sign a contract where we have to promise that we will provide, you know, X amount of capacity to developing countries, or where we will agree on a price. And so there really is this business challenge side of it as well, and this nuance from our perspective of working with that company that's at the right stage that you feel has a technology that they can get out there. But if it's already out there and a success, then it's probably too late to negotiate some of these terms that we like to negotiate. So it's an interesting model. You know, I would love to hear, I think it was quite groundbreaking actually what Marie Paul and her group negotiated with the IEM live attenuated vaccine, to be able to balance what was a late stage vaccine with getting these global access commitments for licensure. So that is a real struggle of what we're trying to do with this program.
So Doug Holtzman from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I wanted to maybe take again a little optimistic sort of technology perspective here, in the sense that we've talked about the regional strategies and trying to get multiple players in. I completely agree with your comments about ultimately these have to be sustainable in the marketplace. But on the technology side, and without wanting to sort of shill for any one company, I think it's very exciting to me, some of the work that's going on in the disposable manufacturing space. That is, I think, you know, there's the human element and the human capacity, and John's touched on that, I think, about making sure you have a culture of GMP and the regulatory structures to support that. But I actually do believe that the technologies can sort of lower the barrier to entry, and I think that having some of these sort of turnkey facilities, if you will, that allow a country that's committed to sort of small-scale production for local use, I think it's going to make it less expensive. I think it's going to make it more reproducible. I think it's going to make it more likely to be safe, not safe in and of itself, but it will enable the production of vaccines, or I believe it should enable the production of vaccines in a less onerous manner from the manufacturing perspective. And I appreciate hearing the comments of John or anybody else in the audience on that topic.
I'm not an expert in this arena, but certainly we look at all varieties of technologies. One of the biggest barriers to vaccine manufacture is the construction of a plant, and it's a multi-million-dollar operation. It requires a tremendous amount of QA, QC, and expertise, and so forth, and ways in which those costs can be reduced by disposable equipment or else is certainly an option. It really, in large part, also is dependent upon the size, the amount that's going to be made, whether or not one option or the other is going to be more cost effective, and I just don't have all that put together myself. Anybody else want to comment on that particular piece? Yes, Tom.
Tom Worf with Barta Infrastructure. I guess I would like to make a comment about disposable. As in buying cars, buying airplanes, buying jet airplanes, like cargo planes like you hear going on in Europe, there's a real hype around disposable. It is a proven technology. It is not the inexpensive technology people make it out to be. Cost of goods running through using complete disposal is actually higher for that kind of facility in the long run, because you have to dispose of everything after every lot. So there is a false sense of both expediency and costing that is given to this disposable market and marketplace, and it can't do everything. You can't use a disposable centrifuge. There's no such thing. So there are aspects about what's been hyped where the reality is not true. I think that there has got to be a recognition that there is not a cheap vaccine. They're economical vaccines, but if you make it right, it's not an inexpensive process. You don't want to kill somebody when you put it in their arm, and that's not an easy thing to accomplish consistently. It takes a skilled workforce. It takes a workforce that works every day, and you got to do it all the time. It is a trade. It is not something that is learned and dropped down. Thank you.
Suresh.
Yeah, I would like to make a few comments on that. First of all, I think when you go for any vaccine production, unless you know what is the quantity that you are making, what is the technology that you are using, and whether you have got the technical people to run that operation. Because unless there is sufficient number which will run for the whole year, because vaccine plant is something which you cannot make it and use it for a short time and then keep it closed. It has to run all 12 months, 24 hours. And to maintain that such a facility, certain amount of return on that investment is required. The returns, according to me, in today's scenario where the CGMP conditions expected to be followed in US, in Europe, or in any developing country are identical. The material that the manufacturers are using are all almost identical. So the cost of production, except for the cost of manpower, is identical. And the cost of manpower in the total cost of your product is not even 10%. So that really doesn't make any difference. That means you must make all the calculations to ensure that there is sufficient return on your investment to keep that facility on. How much profit you want to make is a different issue that every company has its own policy. They can go about it. So unless you have proper technology where there are no impediments from the IPR issues as on today, because we from developing country manufacturers do face a lot of problems for using newer technologies. Newer technologies are available, but then unless they are completely clean and clear for use, you cannot use them. And some of the technologies, I have my experience that we had started our discussion with small startups or research institutes or a organization. We came to some conclusion in 2-3 months, 6 months discussion, and one day we get a phone call, sorry, the technology has been acquired or we have sold it to X, Y, or Z. Fine. We have no complaints on such deals. But what we feel hurt is most of the time these technologies are not used. They are just parked on the shelf. They are not available for us to use because somebody is owner of that. They are not using it. And these technologies many times have been developed in government institutions, whether it is CDC, NIH, or any other universities, which was funding from the governments. So such technologies, if they could be acquired by international agencies or by BARDA, US or WHO, anybody, and then made available to the developing country vaccine manufacturers, that will, I think, be a way forward to look for making and having a sustainable production, not only for influenza, for any vaccine. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously there's a lot more work to be done here, but that's happening to some degree. I mean, the conjugation technology that was licensed from the U.S. FDA and NIH and transferred to Serum Institute for the making of the meningococcal conjugate vaccine is an excellent example. The Alcopicians rotavirus strains being licensed to 7 developing country manufacturers is another, and dengue NIH strains being licensed also is another. There's more work to be done, but at least there's a start.
Okay. Maybe is there?
Actually, the two questions I was going to ask, I think have already been asked and very well. I appreciate the answers. Just an observation. It seems to me that PATH, Abdullah Brooks from ICDRB, Johns Hopkins, sorry. It seems to me that PATH may be in a unique position to not only gather information generically, but empirically on what really works in trying to increase capacity in developing countries and even by region. And I'm wondering if you're giving any thought to that in terms of keeping track of sort of these lessons learned, these observations that will perhaps allow for even set of guidelines to companies or countries that are trying to start up production so they can avoid some of the pitfalls that you've already identified and make this available, that in addition to the new technologies, but just a sort of how-to and what to avoid, sort of manual about developing capacity.
We don't have any product that's actually been licensed in our new development. So we're on the verge, we believe, in very positive and optimistic that the meningococcal A conjugate vaccine will be licensed this year and then available in sub-Saharan Africa next year. And yes, we're certainly amassing the lessons learned, but they're certainly very, very diverse, and they depend in larger part on the capabilities of the organizations that you deal with. So there hasn't been any uniform theme, I think, other than the fact that what can go wrong will go wrong, and that approaching the process development issue, I think, very early on, recognizing that that's going to be a major obstacle is something that one of the lessons that we learned, and certainly one that we'll be applying to working with new organizations. And I think that the clinical side has not been quite as difficult. Some of these clinical trial sites obviously have a lot of infrastructure issues and so forth associated with them, but we've been able to deal with that by virtue of a variety of different trainings and monitorings and so forth. So the clinical side has not been as tough as actually the process development and the manufacturing of the quality. That's been a more difficult area. Kathy, do you want to say anything about the clinical work?
Yeah, I think, Abdullah, you probably know this well. There are a few sites that have done and have the ability to do, and yours is certainly one of them, very high quality clinical trials. I think it's a bit perhaps like the manufacturing. There are other sites that require a lot of capacity building and more partnership. So again, I think in the spirit of equity and in the spirit of trying not to do every trial in the same place, I think it's a real combination in terms of the effort it takes on the ground. And so I would say it's probably as diverse as the manufacturing help in terms of the ease of doing clinical trials and where you do them.
Not on clinical trials, but back to the issue of developing country manufacturers. What I hear, I'm thinking of several comments, Mr. Worf's, that vaccine manufacturing is an expensive enterprise. Your comment that it was the later on interested companies said they wouldn't sign the contract because they had a price. And then Serum Institute saying, in fact, the cost of manufacturing for developed countries versus developing countries are really the same. I think what's not being said is that R&D industry has an investment in their R&D, and they need to recoup that. If we do not find a mechanism to reward that, it goes away. Serum Institute has been able to get technology transfers. That's no R&D investment that has to be recouped. I think we need to not bias the formula here against those actors who in fact invest large quantities of money in R&D. So part of the influenza program then may in fact need to have a financing component to it. If a company is not going to sign a contract for a low fixed price, a commitment for a low fixed price down the road because they need to recoup their investment in the R&D to get this new technology, there needs to be some financial mechanism to allow them to recoup it. And maybe that's a role for the World Bank to step in. I know there's a lot of work going on with, these kinds of financial packages, but I think it's not about altruism. A company is not willing to sign one of these contracts because they're not altruistic and don't want to help the world. I think, just a comment.
No, actually, if I could respond, we completely agree with you, which is why I started my comment saying a company has to have a business model and a strategy. And what we ask for in this contract is for them to look at their business model, and if their business model is that their money will be recouped from seasonal vaccine, or their business model is likely that they will make money by selling product in the industrialized world. So what we ask for is a price commitment actually in the public sector of defined developing countries where they are unlikely to make a lot of money, and we're asking them to break even there. But you're absolutely right. There has to be a business model or none of this will work.
Yeah, we get involved in this. Obviously, it's very, very complex, and it also relates to sustainability. If echoing Kathy's comments, if these development takes place and then you have a manufacturing, these products last for decades, and if you aren't able to negotiate and arrange for a pricing system that allows for not only to recoup costs but also to cover costs and also to allow for profit, it just isn't going to be sustainable. So nobody wins. And arriving at those appropriate pricings are difficult, but something that is just part of the problem.
Okay. But I'm not sure why you can't. I mean, if you're dealing with a lot of cases of state-owned companies where technology transfer would go, and in essence, this is for public health. These companies are not going to make profits. I mean, where is the challenge for the big pharma companies to lose money here, I guess, is my question. Even if they've done the R&D, this is like a trade-off, a wash, so to speak. How are they going to lose money by transferring technology that could be set up to say, okay, you're not going to make a profit on this, you're not going to export vaccine made by this technology, you're going to use it for your own country. Where's the problem there, I guess?
I don't know this across the board, but certainly a number of these state-owned organizations are still basically required to not lose money. And so they have to come up with a pricing system and so forth that will, once they develop and manufacture these products, that they will basically not be a drain on the government. And so it's really important, even for the state-owned organizations that don't have a profit motive, to be able to get this pricing correct. Because otherwise they turn a, they wind up being a drain, and then they get closed down.
Okay. I'm trying to think of the longer term and the ability to respond to a pandemic and a severe pandemic, and the surge capacity. And we've talked about you're working with companies, and there is a crop, so to speak, a group of companies that have a track record, that they're working towards the capacity to with existing technologies or new technologies to manufacture influenza vaccine. I think maybe I see that Marie Paul left the room, but maybe someone else can answer the question. Is there a group of second-tier companies that haven't graduated yet into in every venture there will be a group of, say, 10. Some will succeed, some will fail. That's just the risk of business. But is there a second group or tier of manufacturers or state-owned that we need to be supporting to broaden or increase the first tier, if you catch my meaning?
I'm going to turn that one over to Marie Paul and or Laszlo. Laszlo heard the whole question. Okay. Really, the question had to do with can we broaden the number of organizations that are getting kick-started, if you will, in terms of the influenza vaccine manufacture development.
Are there candidates out there that, or I'm just seeing that there's a tier here that you're working with, and then we talk about those who really would be starting from scratch, that don't have a lot of capacity, and it would be a lot of investment and a lot of time. Are there candidates in between that we should be looking at in addition?
Well, there is a category, I think, of manufacturers that were not selected during the first two calls for proposal that might be worth going back to see where they are. As I mentioned yesterday, I think that we should have a closer look at what is possible in Africa and what is possible also in the ex-Soviet Union. On this, we did have an expression of interest from BioVac in South Africa. We also have had expression of interest from Kazakhstan, for example, on several opportunities. So we may try to see, in particular in these two regions of the world, whether there is a possibility to find good match. I would like also to say that we do also have interest from a few countries in North Africa. For example, I went to Morocco once, and they thinking about organizing maybe something public-private, which may be worth. So I wouldn't say that, in my opinion, that we should, double the number of projects that are going on right now. But I would say something like, a handful might be feasible.
I think that's important for donors to know, because for me, being uneducated in this area, is we need to know the universe of candidates so that we can be thinking about the magnitude of investment in terms of building and getting more candidates to the upper tier. So that's very helpful.
Just as a follow-on, it strikes me that having a second-tier set of companies jump in to influenza as the first vaccine of choice probably not be the strategy, that if you in fact want to expand your vaccine manufacturing base, that you should probably, for example, WHO would talk to its other vaccine programs and perhaps look at some other simpler vaccines to start cutting their teeth on, looking for the long haul to ultimately go to influenza. But I would not maintain that influenza is the vaccine of choice to cut your teeth on as a manufacturer.
Technology, I must just say that actually influenza vaccine is not one of a difficult one. It's relatively easy. The egg, if you choose your eggs well, it's a sterile or quasi-sterile medium. With the company we worked with, we haven't found the technology to be a major hurdle. But I agree with you, John, that and what I said, I don't think that a company can be based only on influenza manufacturing. They need to be doing something else in order to justify the investment.
If I could, once again, I'm showing my ignorance in all of this, there are other sessions later on that we'll be talking about the needs in terms of regulatory support, et cetera. You've spoken, John, about the trying to build capacity in R&D. Are there some general categories of areas that need that you could characterize that first tier? What are they lacking? Is it the sterile environment? Is it the quality control? Is it what in general are the 2 or 3 primary areas that need to be improved in order to move them along?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, R&D obviously is weak in many of these organizations. The concept of CGMP is not well understood. Certainly the quality control aspects, record keeping and so forth are not well understood. I mean, it's a wide variety of shortages. It's not I think a single thing. But having said that, I think there's a tremendous amount of receptivity to training and education, and what NVI is doing, for example, with the hub concept of bringing groups in for training on these issues is very, very useful. I think that's a wonderful application of how to get information and experience basically transferred.
Well, just to comment on that, from the perspective of the pre-qualification of vaccines, we do have an opportunity to look at companies and to see, how they are developing and what are the gaps as we see it from a sort of a global perspective. And I would say that in addition to what you've identified as things like the quality management systems in companies, that is a particular problem that we see. There's often a rapid expansion of capacity once producers do get pre-qualified. And what we tend to see is that it's the expansion of the quality management of the products that tends to lag behind. The money goes into getting more production facilities, more production staff, etc., and it's the quality systems that generally tend to lag behind a bit.
Mm-hmm. Just one more comment, I guess, on the clinical side. We mentioned that the clinical sites and so forth. There's a lot of capabilities there, but there's in my opinion, also a lack of appreciation of the robustness of a clinical development plan that's needed particularly for new products. And we've encountered some really outrageous clinical plans that would result in just several hundred people being vaccinated and so forth, and that's another area that just needs a lot more emphasis in terms of what would be, what we believe at least would be an appropriate development plan. It's not the conduct as much as it is the concept of what it takes to show efficacy and safety.
If I may say, this is often the case in biotechs also, where they quite often think that with a couple of hundred people, this will make it to licensing and use in population.
Yeah, I agree. It's not just a developing country manufacturing issue, it's a biotech issue, and really the groups that do this well are large pharmaceutical companies.
Sorry to dominate the questions here, but in Washington, there's among policymakers, there's a concern about the impact of some of donor governments' policies and past support on the drain of talented and educated, trained people out of developing countries. In your experience, is this area of vaccine R&D, vaccine management an area where brain drain is a problem?
Yes, I would say that, and I can't speak across the board, but certainly in a number of the countries that we work, it's very, very difficult to find skilled nationals in those countries, because they go out to Europe or the United States and get trained and they stay. And so that certainly is a part of the problem. It's a problem certainly on the process development side and R&D side, and certainly even on the clinical side.
I was just going to follow up on the back and forth on the not cutting your teeth on influenza vaccine. It's not so much that the manufacturing itself is complex, but the whole environment of the influenza vaccine is. Which the strain changes, that it's a complex environment. So, but I think in the regulatory session that will become clear.
Just to reemphasize, that's why I really like this, even the egg-based inactivated approach to get these companies started in this field, because they have to deal with the strains every year, and this is a complex issue, and if you're involved in it, it would make, we believe, the transition to a more robust process a heck of a lot easier.
We have a number of representatives of grantees from this program. We have a number of representatives whose countries might be interested in developing or further developing the vaccine manufacturing capacity. And I was just wondering if anyone would be willing to share some of their ideas and experiences in terms of from your experience and from your perspective, what do you see as some of the primary needs that you're facing that might be being addressed through current programs, but more importantly, for the purposes of this workshop, what's not being addressed, or what needs do you have, what gaps do you have that remain unmet?
That would be directed then to any of the grantees from the WHO HHS program.
Or even non-grantees.
Okay.
I think we heard earlier about in Egypt the need for for capacity strengthening for the regulatory authority is something that may be being missed or may take much longer than it should. I don't know. Maybe we have our participant from Nigeria. I think. Do you want to come in on this point?
Sorry, I didn't get your comments.
What are the unmet needs in this area that
And if I could make...
That we haven't, nobody has mentioned yet that from your perspective.
If I could just make it a very direct question, is the program has a fairly limited amount of money. And in order to be able to describe not only what the program is achieving, we also need to understand what it needs to achieve. And if there are unmet needs, what the nature of those needs are, so that we can better understand the kinds and the level of investment that would be needed to address those.
I don't know, any of the... over there, sorry.
Yeah, morning, my name is Ruth Velasquez from Mexico, and I think Suresh gave us a very good summary about the needs. So principally, I think as R&D capacity in order to sustain out Mexico, it's dealing with this pre-qualification of R&D. And obviously, the training for people and also for the construction for facilities. So I think this is the 3 points that we need, and the deals of the developing countries we have felt that.
Okay, thank you. And any other missed, points that have not been brought up yet?
Oh, I just wanted to make a quick comment. I don't know if Dr. Rabi wanted to speak a bit about some of the training needs that Vexera is facing.
As I mentioned earlier, or maybe yesterday, that we have a project for the establishment of a new vaccine, influenza vaccine production line. Since the company hasn't this kind of production, we have other vaccines like typhoid, cholera, DPT, Rift Valley, and some also anti-serum products, but we don't have influenza. So it is a new experience for us in Egypt to have this line. And actually we started this with the WHO, with the support of the WHO and the NVI. And we did the whole visibility study, the marketing study, the technical study, and the economical study. And of course we have a long procedure to go into, which is started already this month by establishing the construction. But in this study, you can have a lot of information concerning the development of our people in the area of the production itself and the quality control, quality assurance, and maybe the regulatory and so on. So I'm talking about some software's requirements that could be a part of the whole project, and of course this will not be achieved unless we have the support of the other companies and the big institutes like the NVI. So if there is any chance, for supporting us in this, because also this will cost us a lot of money concerning the technical transfer and the know-how and so on. So in this case, I'm just trying to be very open and frank that the total cost of the project may reach something between 25 million up to 30 million US dollars. And all the fund that we have right now from our government, $6.5 million plus 1.5 from the WHO, and we are of course willing to have the rest of the support of the WHO with the other $3 million. But still we have a gap in funding the projects. So I don't need to have the money in my hand, but I need somebody to help me in completing the project. If it is software or if it is hardware, whatever. So this is the situation actually in Egypt now. But we have a very clear plan that in 2 years' time we should have this plant operating. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
So my name is Masato Tashiro from the Ministry of Health, Japan. And we have collaborating with many developing countries to establish the national vaccination policy for influenza. And before discussing to the sustainable production capacity, we should identify the need or demand for the influenza vaccine for seasonal use. And for this, the surveillance and of the influenza disease burden and the seasonality and so on, that's very important. And in China and Thailand is a good example. They have performed national surveillance system for the disease burden and the economical impact for more than 10 years. Then finally, the government decided to introduce a vaccination policy for seasonal influenza. So, and such surveillance study is necessary to establish the sustainable production capacity.
Thank you. Yeah. I think, yeah.
I'm Phil Krause at FDA. I'm a relative newcomer to this field, but it seems to me that there really are two issues here. One of them is how does one deal with the seasonal vaccine issue, and I agree completely that getting the right kind of surveillance in place and determining what the demand is, and in individual countries persuading people that they need the seasonal vaccine based on the actual data are certainly going to be very important. But then there's also the issue of how to deal with the pandemic problem and creating the surge capacity which is needed in the event that there is another pandemic with a virus which is more virulent than the one that we're experiencing right now. And I think that having listened to the presentations, that the pandemic is sort of what's driving a lot of the discussions, and it certainly is creating additional political impetus to do something because of biosecurity issues and things like that as well. And yet it also sounds like if one takes the sum total of the efforts which have been described here and asks the question of by when will there be enough vaccine produced by these measures to have a substantial impact in the context of a real pandemic which is causing significant public health problems around the world, the answer is that's going to be a long time. And if one also adds to that the excellent presentations by Robin Robinson and Armin Donabedian yesterday, where they sort of described the U.S. approach towards thinking about new technologies for dealing with the pandemic, bringing in recombinant vaccines and new ways of solving these problems so that real surge capacity can be produced, it sort of begs the question also of whether simply the efforts which are being described here, especially in the context of the egg-based vaccines, are going to be enough, certainly over the short run. So I guess I'm a little bit surprised not to see a discussion, and maybe this is by design, of what it will take to make sure that there is enough vaccine to go around the world until we reach the time when each country is actually self-sufficient in that regard. And I think that was the one message I got from the gentleman from Nigeria yesterday, because it was one of the things he brought up is, we're getting a couple million doses of vaccine, but the demand is likely to be much larger. How do I get more vaccine? So I think that's the question that over the short term people want to know the answer to, and given the brain power that's in this room, it seems as though it would be useful to try and get answers to that question as well.
Yeah. Maybe if I can add something to this. In developed countries in the United States and in Japan, there's certainly very good surveillance for influenza, and there is a very strong public health promotion campaign, asking people to be vaccinated. And still, maybe the argument is not as persuasive as it might be in demonstrating how worthwhile it is to vaccinate against influenza, even in these fairly developed markets as far as influenza vaccination goes. So maybe there's a little bit of work to be done there too in Japan, in the United States, showing why are we vaccinating, what are the benefits, so that the public is persuaded to be vaccinated at higher rates. I mean, the challenge in developing countries is going to be much greater, unfortunately, because there's a data problem and there are also many competing priorities and needs that are difficult to deal with. But maybe there's some work to be done in these sort of vaccination markets. Is there any other final comments or something that we have forgotten? Okay, thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause to our speaker, and let's have some coffee.